Hello and welcome back to the Newsnight studio, where we're going straight into some of the issues that were raised in that edition of Storyville. We'll start by focusing on the economic outlook for the European Union. Joining me are Bill Emmott, who wrote the film, which represents very much his personal view, the UKIP MP Mark Reckless, and Lord Lamont, a former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. Marina Prentoulis of the Greek governing party Syriza also joins us from Athens. Later in the programme, we'll hear from other guests, but before we begin, let's just remind ourselves of some of the concerns raised in the film.
On the present path, the risks of a breakdown are rising. So the breakup of the euro would be carnage, economically and politically, and it's quite unlikely the European Union would survive.
Let's throw that point to our panel. Lord Lamont, Martin Wolf of the FT is absolutely right, isn't he? The breakup of the Eurozone and, he believes, the consequential breakup of the European Union would be carnage, wouldn't it?
I think it would be very difficult. I always say the euro is a bit like a lobster pot. You can crawl in, very easy to get in, but once you're in, it's very difficult to get out. It's quite different from a fixed exchange rate system, say the ERM, because of the degree of financial integration that has gone on in Europe, the monetary integration and the imbalances. And I think it would cause a lot of chaos. There have been various books and pamphlets written about ways in which you might get out, but actually I think the risks of it are high. Mind you, staying in, the euro continuing, I think poses a very dismal future for the European Eurozone.
Mark Reckless, I mean, plainly you don't believe that the UK should ever join the euro, but do you think the euro can survive?
I don't know. It faces some very serious challenges. I mean, Martin Wolf, I remember reading him for years in the FT, explaining what a terrible thing the euro is going to be and the damage it would do. And then at the end, he supported it in any event, which I never understood. But what I think the euro is doing is it's driving Europe apart, both economically, but also putting division among the peoples of Europe. And we see in Italy and in Spain, most recently in Greece, that it undermines national democracy. And we've just seen Syriza give way and basically accept that the government of Greece is determined not by the Greek people, but by the European Commission and the European Central Bank.
I mean, so the central argument, the economic argument, that the way the euro is currently managed, Mark Reckless, you'd say, you would agree that at the moment it is impoverishing too many people?
I do. I mean, I wrote a book in 1998 called The Euro Bad for Business, and it gives me no pleasure to say that most of what we've seen has come to pass as I and others predicted back at that time. But despite knowing the risks, the people who are constructing Europe decided to take that economic risk because they hoped it would be a great leap forward for the EU, and it would force a political union which otherwise people would not have the appetite for. And it is not right that the people who should get the blame for this are those who put that aircraft into the sky without landing gear, rather than those of us who point out that sooner or later it must run out of fuel.
I mean, if I could just ask Marina Prentoulis, in Greece, the austerity forced upon you led to the economy contracting by a quarter, massive rises in unemployment and poverty. Why on earth does the new Syriza government want to stay in the euro?
Well, first of all, good evening from Athens. I can hear you a little bit, but I cannot see you very much, so more trouble for the Greek people. But let me start by saying how I disagree with the discussion I can hear so far. Right. For us, the problem is not the European Union, and we have to remember where the European Union started from. The European Union was the connection of the people of Europe, thinking that they have a common future, freedom, democracy, justice and equality. So it is not the European Union per se, but the direction that the European Union is taking because of the neoliberal policies and the austerity policies that they have been imposed on it.
But these policies are central to the Eurozone, aren't they? So why do you want to stay in the Eurozone if this austerity is so written into the philosophy of the Eurozone?
The austerity, as you said, is creating a huge damage, and mostly in Greece right now. But we have to think where Syriza is standing. Syriza was thinking that there is, and there is always a possibility, because it is a political matter, that we could stay within the Eurozone, and we could have a Eurozone without austerity politics and policies. Yeah? So for us, it's neoliberalism and austerity politics that are destroying the Eurozone, and I hope they are not going to destroy the European Union. But actually, what is Syriza discussing and negotiating these days is the true European voice. It is that we have an alternative. We can do things differently.
But Marina Prentoulis, you've had this negotiation largely with Berlin and you've lost. I mean, you have had the kind of conservative austerity policies that you rejected in your election campaign forced upon you.
I don't think we lost in the same way that you put it, and I don't think that the negotiations were with Berlin necessarily. I think there is a much bigger neoliberal conservative bloc that it is trying to stop Syriza. And our call is to all progressive forces of the European Union. Okay, I'm not going to say that it was a huge victory and a huge win, but we won some things. And the first thing that we won is that for the first time, a Greek government started to negotiate with its partners. And this is a very big deal. And people felt that. They felt that they are regaining their dignity and they will be respected within the Eurozone as partners. But there are other things that they think, I hope they will follow from these negotiations. I hope that we will be able to ease the austerity measures. I hope that we will manage to deal with tax avoidance. So I think Syriza is winning something, and it's winning for all the people of Europe.
Thank you. Lord Emmott, I think you wanted to come in there.
Well, I was going to say, I think the justification, the explanation that's being given as to why Greece wants to remain in the euro, despite the traumatic effects it has, underlines a central point about the euro, which is that it is a political creation, and it is created for political reasons. Between France and Germany, it's about making sure you don't have war a fourth time in 100 years. For Greece, Spain, and Portugal, I think it is a badge of modernity. It's putting the fascist dictatorship, military dictatorship behind. But unfortunately, what they created was a sort of nonsense, a currency without a government, without risk sharing, without transfer union, without fiscal cooperation. This is an impossibility, and what it is a single currency which is run on the level, on the same way that the Deutschmark was run, but with the Bundesbank dictating all the policies to the rest of Europe.
I mean, Bill Emmott, you wouldn't disagree with quite a lot, I think, of Lord Lamont's analysis, and your prescription, to a large extent, is that Germany should lead a sort of new Marshall Plan, that Germany should lead a great investment project for Europe. But it's inconceivable, isn't it, that Germany, with its philosophy that all debts have to be repaid, Germany with this idea that it made this great sacrifice to build its industrial might, will ever be seen to be, in its sense, sort of bailing out the reckless policy, or its view, bailing out the reckless policies of other governments.
Well, I think you've put your finger on the problem, which is trust. I mean, it's that there's a loss of trust in this euro. But let's just remember, let's return to the real world for a moment. Fiscal austerity, fetishism about austerity, this is rather common in Britain at the moment. It's the central issue of our election, and we're wrong too, in my opinion. So that's one, and UKIP is pushing for more austerity. So, and the Tories are in favor of it. Second, this euro, the nonsense, the terrible project, it's doomed, has been joined by more countries since the crisis began. So some other countries think that this is there to survive, and nobody's wanted to leave it. So in my view, it can be fixed, it must be fixed, and the Germans have got to move.
Inevitably, we could take hours debating the rights and wrongs of the euro, but as it happens, there are a number of other really fascinating points in your film, and I want to now go on to another one. In the first part of the film, of course, you concentrated on the economy, but then you moved on to the challenges posed by immigration. Freedom of movement within the European Union is one of its core principles. Some 14 million European Union citizens are resident in another member state, and, to state the obvious, this has not been without controversy. And that's without taking into account immigration into the EU from elsewhere. Now, in a moment, we'll ask whether and how this could be reviewed. But first, let's just see another clip from the film where a resident in Margate gives his views on the immigrants in his area.
We over here struggling, and other families come over from different countries, get everything handed to them, and we over here struggling. There's people living on the streets. We should sort our own people out before sorting out other people from other nationalities. No, the people come over here and work, that's fine. People that don't come over here and work, just a drain of society, you know what I mean? It's like everything, our money, national health, everything. Homes, you know?
Well, we still have Bill Emmott and Mark Reckless here, but we've been joined also by Peter Hitchens, a columnist for the Mail on Sunday, and by Sonia Soda, who's an associate of the Demos think tank. Bill Emmott, Titch in your film is absolutely right, isn't he? I mean, it's all very well to talk about the general benefits of immigration, but if you are a British person in an area where cheap labour is coming in and you lose your job or your wages are driven down, you have paid a price. I mean, the Liberal establishment have been fibbing for years, haven't they, about the impact of immigration on individuals, not about the economy as a whole, but the impact on people.
Well, I think that they do play that down, and of course the Liberal establishment often like to employ immigrants themselves, so of course one has to concede that point. But what one should also say is he really worrying about immigration, or is he actually worrying about the economic crisis, which has lost him his job, made life difficult for him, suppressed the incomes of millions of British people, and they're looking for something to blame? I think the funny thing with immigration is that we used to never talk about it. Now we talk about nothing else. And immigration is really a cover for a whole lot of other problems, which, you know, obviously are connected.
I mean, Mark Reckless, your party is obviously very much campaigning to be able to introduce slightly more limits on immigration. But we have an ageing population. How are we going to pay for the health service, which is becoming more and more expensive as the population ages, for our pensions, if our population is not being increased at the younger age group by immigrants?
Well, you said in the film that we suffer from low birth rates. I think that's true for a number of European countries. I don't think it's particularly true for Britain, France or Scandinavia. And also immigrants in due course will grow old as well. So I don't think that can be a solution. And you know, clearly people are going to have to work longer to support themselves, partly in retirement. But what I took from your clip was that people feel that they're economically in competition. And if you allow unlimited movement from countries with much lower incomes than here, then it's very difficult for people like those we saw to get jobs or to move up the career ladder or to better themselves. And obviously employers will be keen to carry on sort of paying people less or getting very hard-working people without having to pay more. But does that benefit the people who are here in the country at the moment? So I'm not convinced it does.
I mean, Peter Hitchens, one of the things that's striking when people are polled about immigration, feeling is often strongest in areas where there are fewer immigrants. Doesn't that tend to suggest that the problem isn't, as Bill Emmott says, actually immigration? It's a wider economic problem.
Well, it's all part of the misrepresentation which I think Mr. Emmott has made in his programme of the case against the European Union. He refers, for instance, to people who oppose the European Union as anti-European. It's a ludicrous concept in the first place. How can one be against a continent? They're against the political, economic and social body called the European Union. They think it's wrongly conceived and it's not fitted for this country. Similarly, people are not against immigrants. They're against the politicians who have launched the most extraordinary wave of mass immigration, which has transformed the country out of all recognition, especially for poorer people. And therefore, their complaints are perfectly legitimate and cannot be mischaracterized except by their enemies as some kind of racialist, foaming, contemptible response, but should be treated seriously. But this is what the proponents of the European Union will never do. They have never understood the objections to their project, and they have always misrepresented and actually slandered those who oppose it. And your film does that at great length, at great and in fact rather tedious length. It repeatedly makes these false points.
Sonia Soda, the weight of economic evidence on immigration is a bit unclear. So, for example, recent research was genuinely uncertain whether over the longer term immigration in this country would be a net cost or a net benefit? What's your view?
Well, I think actually it's a mistake to have this debate just in terms of the economics, and I think actually one of the lessons from the recent Scottish referendum was just talking about the cold, hard economics of it isn't really a way of winning hearts and minds. Now, I think actually some of the people in the film raising concerns, there are some legitimate concerns there. There was also a lot of exaggeration of the impact of immigration. But at the end of the day, we know that immigration, you know, some of the evidence is unclear, but effects have been felt differentially by different parts of the population. And some members of the population do have legitimate concerns about impacts on wages for the type of work that they do. So it's all very well if you're a banker who employs lots of services like nannies and cleaners, but if you're working in those industries, it probably doesn't feel so great. And I think Peter's actually got a point, which is around there are some legitimate concerns, and I'm a strong believer in a reformed European Union. I think there are values that bring the people of Europe together, but I think certain projects within the EU, I think freedom of movement is one of them, I think the euro is another, sort of represent a kind of overreaching of the EU that goes beyond the legitimacy that's kind of imbued in those institutions. And I think the positive thing is actually that the political debate over the last year has moved in this direction. So we've gone from very populist moves like vans driving around London, telling immigrants to go home, adverts placed in Romanian newspapers, you know, advertising the fact that Britain's got bad weather, to actually a more intelligent debate by both Cameron and Miliband, I think, which is around, you know, we can support freedom of movement as a basic principle, but should it be completely unqualified freedom of movement?
So, Bill Emmott, for you, would a more stable European Union be a more integrated European Union, or, as Sonia says, one actually which, you know, involves itself in national matters rather less?
Well, I think that most of the problems of our countries are actually self-inflicted. That's one thing. What a stable European Union would look like would be one where it actually fulfilled the promise of the European Union. In other words, creating a single market for services, for the digital economy, for all of the things that we want to sell all across the continent, creating a proper integrated energy system for the whole continent where we could trade with each other freely in energy. It would be more Europe, but it wouldn't be more central control. It would be more connection, more coordination, and therefore more trust.
All of that kind of thing could be achieved without a supranational body. And there was never any reason to have a supranational body taking away the sovereignty of countries to achieve these things. In fact, it's remarkable how unintegrated Europe is. When you cross a European border on a railway train, they have to change the locomotive, and yet we have the same currency. It is a ridiculous backwards thing. You've started building your structure by putting up the roof.
Well,
and then waiting for someone else to come along and put the walls
to your point,
up.
we could achieve international football competitions without FIFA. We could fight together without NATO.
But football is not the making and breaking of nations.
No, but NATO is, and we've built NATO for good reasons. We've built the United Nations for good reasons. I mean, why destroy it? It's there.
Well,
why not make it work?
There's a very good reason for dismantling NATO, is the purpose for which it's formed no longer exists. But that's another question. But the question we're discussing here is the European Union a unique experiment in building a supranational body? And in your opening stretch, where Churchill's Zurich speech is given, and there are all kinds of things lying on the ground, referring to the Council of Europe, a body which was never intended to be supranational, which was intended to promote European cooperation at an intelligent, practical level, a completely different objective, which the European Union has ditched in favour of this wild supranational experiment, which plainly is not working, as your film quite obviously shows.
And there won't be a stable European Union because its goal is ever closer union, and it was founded on a principle and set of structures which recognised that it wasn't wanted. The reason it was created in the way it was to give a bureaucratic inertia to drive through its ever closer union, despite the peoples of Europe not wanting that.
But wait a minute, come on, that's not quite right. I mean, you know, the 6 who founded the European community wanted it. We wanted to join in 1973 and it became 9. Spain and
we didn't
and
want
Greece
to join in
wanted to
1973.
join.
The polls were very strongly against, and we only voted for it once we were already in. Our lowest ebb as a nation.
And when we'd been lied to about what it was.
Absolutely.
Systematically
It
lied
was
to
about
what it
creating a
was.
single market, and it's not yet
Well,
been done.
it was about creating a single political entity.
Now, the
you're only
great
allowed
thing
to sell
about all of
anything
this
that obeys a single set of rules.
is the extraordinary passion that it invokes in all of us. So let's just move on now to the final bit of your film, which is the challenge facing the expanded European Union in maintaining the peace within its borders and around them. Before its establishment, Germany and France, as we all know, had fought a series of wars over a 70-year period, and the desire to prevent any repeat of this was one of the major reasons for the EU's creation. Since its foundation, it has accepted new members from former dictatorships such as Greece, Portugal and Spain, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it accepted some members of the former Eastern Bloc into its fold. Can the European Union take the credit for maintaining peace in Europe? In a moment, we'll ask our panel, but first, let's see another clip from Bill Emmett's film.
Your aircrew are working to ready for assault.
To be brutally honest, so am I. But fear can make you value the important things in life. See this medal? Everyone laughed when the EU was given the Nobel Peace Prize. That's because they'd forgotten that before the EU, Europe was decimated with hundreds of years of war. In the 20th century alone, 50 million people, that's a tenth of the population, died in war.
Bill Emmott, Mark Radcliffe and Peter Hitchens are still here. Peter Hitchens, surely no one can deny that the European Union has played an important role in maintaining the peace within Europe.
I've never seen any evidence to maintain any peace at all. What actual tension has there been between France and Germany since the foundation of the European Union, which it has resolved, which might have led to war? With the threat of war during most of the European Union's existence in its various forms came from the Soviet Union. And was,
so Churchill was just wrong that this
contained.
project was a complete waste of time, in your view?
Well, what Churchill said in his Zurich speech was actually a plea for Germany and France to reconcile. That's what that speech is mainly about. And he then says that the British Commonwealth, the Soviet Union and the United States should act as sponsors of this rather unlikely marriage, which then indeed did take place. But there has not been. The European Union has successfully institutionalised the conflict between France and Germany, as well it might, because France can't really conceive of starting
But that's a good thing, isn't
having
it?
another war with Germany. Yes, but there hasn't been a war which the European Union has prevented. You could, on the other hand, argue that the European Union might have played some part in the breakup of Yugoslavia, and you could certainly say that the European Union has helped to start the worst European war of my lifetime in Ukraine. And there's absolutely no doubt at all that European Union aggression into that area, its attempt to deneutralise Ukraine and align it with the European Union and NATO bloc has led to a very, very serious conflict. So to call it a bringer of peace is laughable. And indeed, it's quite right to laugh at it getting the Nobel Prize.
I mean, Bill Emmott, Peter Hitchens is right, hasn't it? Isn't he? I mean, you know, the European Union has been hopeless in Ukraine, hasn't it?
Well, let's just remember, I mean, there's a rather selective requirement for democracy coming across from over there. The people of Ukraine overthrew their government twice. The people of eastern Ukraine have rebelled against the people of western Ukraine.
The people of Ukraine overthrew their government in a mob putsch, which overthrew a legitimately elected president, whom you describe in your film as a dictator. Now, if you think that simply because you don't like somebody, you can annul his election and describe him as a dictator, that's your idea of journalism. It's a very odd way of proceeding. He was legitimately elected. He could have been removed by another election. He was overthrown by a violent mob putsch in which at least 20 police officers were killed. And you call that democratic?
I mean, I carry no
or lawful. I don't know what your definitions of these things can conceivably be.
I carry no brief for Yanukovych in Ukraine, but I don't have a selective interpretation of democracy, and I must take Bill Emmott up on his suggestion that somehow the peoples of Europe want that. Every time they're given a chance to vote, whether over Maastricht, whether over the Treaty of Nice, whether over the European Constitution, whether it was Denmark, Ireland, France, Holland, they vote no. And that is ignored. And the elites, the civil servants, the European Commission, the people who benefit from this and the elite who set themselves apart from the people, just carry on with it regardless. The project is fundamentally undemocratic. And if anything, that surely has to increase the risk, if not of war, at least of driving the peoples of Europe apart.
I think it's rather wrong to say that they've been ignored when they've rejected the European Constitution. As a result, the Constitution didn't
It was just renamed as the Treaty of Lisbon. There's virtually no difference between the Treaty of Lisbon and the European Constitution. That is not the case.
It is the case,
as you well know. There are tiny differences.
A lot of the reason why the European Union doesn't work very well in terms of its decision-making is because that constitution was rejected. I criticised that constitution. I said it should be rejected in my newspaper, The Economist. I said it should be chucked in the nearest wastepaper bin. But nevertheless...
But it was then implemented
it wasn't implemented.
Almost in the same terms, notwithstanding the votes against.
We're arguing about war and peace, as far as I recall. And it seems to me that one has to address this problem of Ukraine. And I'm not a defender of President Yanukovych either, but I have to point out the simple fact that he was overthrown by illegitimate means, and the Constitution of Ukraine was ignored in his removal, and this cannot be portrayed by anybody as democracy. And this was in the course of the negotiation of an association agreement, which clearly it would contain political and military clauses, and which clearly changed the alignment of Ukraine from being non-aligned and neutral between the European Union and Russia to being aligned with the European Union. This is an aggressive action. How can you call an organisation which does this kind of thing peaceful?
But hang on, just
or democratic come to that.
I know it's quite hard to put Ukraine to one side, but if we could just put it to one side for a second. If the UK were not part of the European Union, do you think we would have the faintest chance of influencing the course of events when there are, conflicts in the rest of the world? We would simply become America's poodle in those circumstances.
Well, we are already America's poodle. That's a given. But whether the European Union increases our ability to influence is a very strange argument. What it means is that we have to get involved in the European Union's disputes on behalf of other nations, particularly Germany, with the United States, instead of negotiating for ourselves. As far as I understand it, Mexico has better trading arrangements with the European Union than we do, and almost any country can negotiate with China on its own if it wants to, perfectly freely. The Peter Mandelson clip in your film is particularly ridiculous, where he seems to suggest that a country of 60 million people can't negotiate on its own with China and is unable to make its own trade agreements. What are we, some kind of kindergarten country? We're an experienced independent nation.
But you said in your film, I think, that if the euro broke up, it would bring down the world economy. And there are clearly risks in the euro, actually, whether it stays or whether it goes. But I just thought that was a very Eurocentric view, and I would like us to trade freely with the whole world, and particularly with the large and emerging markets in the world, rather than the only declining continent tying ourselves to that. And
OK, that's an interesting point. We do trade freely with the rest of the world, of course.
There's a common external tariff around us. Why should we have tariffs? Why should a British woman have to pay more for a bra in order to protect southern European producers when we don't produce hardly any here ourselves?
You may have noticed that Germany does rather better in dealing with these fast-growing parts of the world than Britain does.
Yes,
Britain is geographically next to Europe. It is always going to trade very freely with Europe.
Because when the European Union negotiates, it focuses on some of those industries where Germany does well out and protecting some of the inefficient industries in southern Europe, rather than focusing on expanding the market and opening overseas markets to the internationally traded services that our country does well.
Well, if you look at
drifted away from war and peace, which seemed to me to be the point of this discussion, and I would say, what force other than the European Union could have produced newspapers in Greece depicting Angela Merkel as Hitler? What other force could have produced a rupture so deep between two European nations in the 21st century than the ludicrous economics and politics of the European Union?
Well, frankly, we do that on our own when we play football against Germany. We do that quite freely in our own press. I don't think that this is...
Why do you keep bringing the debate back to football?
No, OK.
It suggests a certain weakness in your other arguments, I think.
I have a nasty feeling we're not going to resolve this tonight, although I have greatly enjoyed the exchange of views. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. Bill